we have then fairly efficiently covered the two initial aspects of explainability, what the human experience is of this part of AI ethics, and what the definition is, the theoretical definition of explainability. What I would like to do now is progress quickly to talk about what is most likely the central theme of explainability, and that is accountability, especially with respect to the AI tool itself. So let me give you an example. Here we have a Tesla, and we'll imagine this is a driverless car which has driven into a store window and broken the window. Right. The question that the police officer has in this image is, well, who do I blame? Whose fault is it that this car went over the curb like this? Whose fault? Who should I deliver the traffic accident ticket to? Who should I arrest if someone needs to be arrested? Now, let's assume that this car caused this accident while it was running on autopilot mode. That is, while a human was not driving it, but the computer itself. The problem we have is that if this AI is a black box, that is, if we do not know how the AI is processing information, or if we don't understand how the initial training data, which is brought in to train the tool, how that created the algorithmic decisions that finally resulted in the car being driven. If there's some part of this process that we do not understand, then it becomes impossible to determine who should be blamed. So as just a simple example, if we don't know whether it is the training data or the algorithmic decision making that caused this accident, then we don't know whether we should blame the designer of the AI tool, the person who wrote the algorithms, or the provider of the training data. And we could go a little bit further. It might be that there is a human driver in the car, and it might be that the car is supposed to turn control over to humans at a moment of uncertainty. Um, did that moment of uncertainty occur? Do we know when it occurred? If it did occur, did the human take control or not? Did the machine record, or can it somehow make us understand after the fact whether or not the human was alerted, and in what way, and in what moment? All of these questions are tied up with the question of accountability. You have a trackback accident. Who do the police get mad at? Who do the police arrest if someone needs to be arrested? Now, this has special significance in a specific area, in the area of what is called the accountability gap. The accountability gap is very significant because it is something that is unique to AI and distinguishes our life in the digital economy from our life in the industrial economy. Now, in the industrial economy, we had a problem very similar to what is called the accountability gap for AI. And that problem was called the many hands problem. Now, the many hands problem is modern cars, when they are constructed for human drivers, have components typically that are shipped in from all over the world. It's not the case that Ford Motor Company or Fiat or Volkswagen or any of these companies make their own cars from the ground up. Instead, what they tend to do is they assemble components that they purchase from diverse places. So it would sometimes happen, let's say a car's brakes fail, it would sometimes happen that part of those brakes were constructed in Germany, a different part of those brakes were constructed in Japan, the brakes were put together in Mexico, and then the brakes were installed in the car in Detroit. Now, in that case, if the brakes fail, where does the blame lie? In Japan? In Mexico? In Detroit? It frequently is difficult to unravel the source of the problem, but with the many hands problem and in the industrial economy, Typically, with enough work and enough time, you can, in fact, unravel what the source of the problem was. And you can go back and find, oh, look, there was this particular person in this particular assembly line in Mexico who made this mistake. And for that reason, the components broke and the installation failed and the car had an accident. In practice, however, sometimes it would be very difficult in the industrial economy to go back and find out exactly who is to blame for a problem like brake failure. The difference with AI is that it can be completely impossible. That is, it's not a practical problem, but it is a theoretical problem. And it is a theoretical problem when the AI works on a machine learning kind of model. That is, when the AI, the driverless car, is actually learning and changing itself after it leaves the factory. And in fact, experiments are going on with cars to help them do this, for example, or more directly to learn from their drivers. So, for example, drivers, of course, have different habits. I myself, I'm a bad boy. I tend to drive just above the speed limit. If I had an AI-driven car, it could learn that's the way I'm comfortable driving from the time when I am in control of the car. And then when I turn control over to the AI, the car could follow that lead and drive a little bit over the speed limit. This is not something that was trained to do by the training data, not something that it was programmed to do in the factory. Instead, it was something that learned simply by feeding back the driving habits of its owner into its own algorithms. Sort of learning, in a sense, that when the car is on a freeway and the limit is 65 miles an hour, the car will drive 70. So, in that case, we have a real problem because it's impossible to say exactly who is responsible for setting this speed that the car is driving. The original producer of the car, when they made it, when they designed it to respond and learn from the way the owner was driving, they had no way of knowing how the owner was going to drive. And the owner, just as a purchaser and user of the car, has no way of knowing how the AI, precisely at least, is going to react to the way he or she drives. So it's not just a practical problem, it is a theoretical problem within the neural network and the black box of the tool, or stated slightly more specifically, within the way the tool learns itself how to weight and reweight the different factors that lead it to make decisions about, for example, how fast it should go, or how close it should follow behind the car in front of it, or how tightly it should take a turn left or right, or how early it should come slow to come to a stop at a stop sign. All these things are aspects of driving that a car could learn from its owner, but the owner again has no way of knowing exactly how the car would be learning. And the designer had no way of knowing how the driver would drive. And even after the fact, there's no way to go back and find out exactly how these weights were arrived at within the tool because it is a kind of black box. So this reality, a reality where there's finally a result where the car is doing something and there's no way to know who is responsible for what the car is doing, this is called the accountability gap. And as I say, it differs from the industrial economy where there was a many hands problem. That is, a lot of different people are involved in the production of a car, and it makes for a practical difficulty for accountability and assigning blame for problems. But here with AI, in the accountability gap, we have a theoretical difficulty. It's literally impossible, in some cases, to assign blame or credit for the behavior of a car in one or another situation. So this creates an obvious problem. What do we do when there's no one to blame for an accident? Here is a specific quote from a U.S. government Department of Transportation report on an accident with a Tesla motor car on autopilot. It ran into a truck. The quote is, autonomous vehicles behave in ways that are not necessarily the result of preset settings, but rather of technical decision making. Therefore, the programmers cannot foresee how the vehicle will operate at any given time, and thus there may not be a causal connection between the human programmer and the end result in the way that could impose liability on the programmer. That's a long way of saying there's no way to know who's at fault when this accident occurred. This specific accident happened in Florida, and we're going to talk more about it in the next session. But here, what's important is simply the explainability gap. Who is to blame because we had this accident? We don't know. Now, this was a Tesla car, and Tesla responded by saying, look, it might be that there is an explainability gap. In fact, there is. But it's nevertheless the case that this was the first known fatality in just over 130 million miles where autopilot was activated. In the US, there's a fatality every 94 million miles, and worldwide, a fatality every 60 million miles. So, what Tesla is saying is that this accountability gap is justified because the car is safer than a human driver. So what we have here is just a different form of exactly that dilemma we saw at the start with Jeffrey Hinton. Tesla is saying, look, when you have the AI autopilot in control, we save lives. You can count them, at least in terms of miles. And the saving is quite significant if these statistics are correct. The problem is, again, when something goes wrong, we can't blame Tesla because they had no way of knowing how the car would develop once it left their factory floor. Tesla says it's worth it. Just like someone might say in the Jeffrey Hinton example, it's worth it. I don't know how the machine will do what it will do, but if it gives me better results, if it saves lives, I don't need explainability. It's a very fair position, and that's the position that Tesla is taking here. However, there are others who are going to say, no, a life has been lost. And part of what perhaps human dignity requires is that there be accountability. Someone needs to be blamed. Someone did something wrong. In this case, probably not. But one reason why we want to wrap this up, one reason why we want explainability is so that there can be accountability. So that when the car makes a mistake and someone dies, we can determine, was it the AI programmer that made this mistake? Was it the person who created the training data that made the mistake? Or was it simply the result of careless driving by the human owner that then was learned by the car that caused the accident? We can force AI to be explainable in ways we will talk about shortly. And if we do, that will allow us accountability for accidents. It will allow us to say that someone should be blamed. So when people talk about explainability in AI, to wrap this up, typically they are talking about that because they want there to be accountability, meaning both someone to be blamed when something goes wrong, but perhaps also people to be credited when things go right. And of course, this exists, to go back one step, because of this accountability gap. Because in AI, as it is presently used, frequently, especially in complicated tools like driverless cars, there's no way to know exactly why the car, made the decision it made. Those who are uncomfortable with that insist that AI must be changed to be made explainable.